Hello, everybody. Jerry Weinstock here. Hope you're having fun from wherever you are on the planet. We're going to get started with the Power Platform API request presentation here. A little bit about me. I've been working with Microsoft CRM or Dynamics 365 since 2003. Had the opportunity, pleasure, and privilege and honor of being a business applications MVP for 10 years now. If you want to get in contact with me, the easiest way to reach me is to go out to LinkedIn and just search for Jerry Weinstock, and you'll see me come up. You'll see me either the motorcycling, off-road motorcycling picture in the background, or the water skiing picture. That's how the easiest way to differentiate me from anybody else, or reach out to me on Twitter or by email, jweinstock@anthology.com. I work at Anthology, which is a higher education. Let me make sure here. Oops, we're not sharing here correctly. Okay, sorry. Now I'm sharing correctly. That would make more sense. So here's information on my profile. Once again, sorry about that little miscue. I work at Anthology. Anthology is a ISV that has a solution for the higher education marketplace for colleges, universities, public and private throughout the world. And my specialty is what we're doing with Power Automate Flow. And primarily, while I'm doing solutioning in general for the Dynamics 365 platform, my focus is what we're doing in particular with using Flow for integrations between the Dynamics platform and external services such as SAT and ACT scores, Common App, or other student information systems. So here's how you get in contact with me, and I will move on. There should be plenty of time here at the end to ask some questions. So what I'm going to talk to you about here is the difference between what is published on the docs site, what you may have heard or read, and what actually is happening. Okay, and we're going to go over some of these differences, and then I'm going to show you some information in the Flow environment to see how you can overcome some of these challenges today, and examples of things that you cannot overcome. So everything that you're going to hear and see today has either been reverse engineered or from questions that I've posed to the product team. One of the perks of being a Microsoft MVP is you get access to these NDA distribution lists where you can ask questions of the product team. I can do that. I've done that. And in fact, I've had a couple conversations with Charles Lamanna, who is a corporate VP. He is Mr. Power Platform. He owns the entire technical solution for the low-code application. Everything that you're going to hear today is not under NDA. Nothing. You're not going to hear anything from me that's been told to me that's under my non-disclosure agreement as MVP. The easiest way to get kicked out of the program is to divulge something that you should not do that. So I've signed that agreement. You're not going to hear everything. Like I said, and in fact, Lamanna has vetted this slide deck himself, and he and Steven Siciliano, the Power Platform Automate principal program manager, has signed off on it also. So everything's legit, but what you're going to hear from me is in contradiction to what is currently published, and that's just kind of where Microsoft is at this point in time. So the first thing I want to start this off with is something that confused me and I had wrong from the very beginning, and I kept referring to API calls as a consumption, API consumption, and I wasn't using the term entitlement, and that's a challenge basically, because that's not the way that Microsoft thinks of it, and that's not the way that Microsoft has set this up. Okay. They've set it up with entitlements. Entitlements are an allocation based upon a license or a user class. Consumption is something that is thought of on a Azure basis, and this is not Azure based. So we need to think about it in terms of entitlement, and then there is a daily API request limit that's associated with your entitlement. Okay, move on to my next slide. So one thing I want to set aside is the notion of service protection limits, and that is different than entitlement. Service protection limits are enforced to make sure that you don't overwhelm the web server and you're not a extremely noisy neighbor during a certain period of time. And as a consequence, there are some limits. The key limits are really two of the three listed here. One is the number of requests, which is 6,000 within a 5-minute sliding window, okay, by the user, and then the execution time of those requests. Those are something that's really non-negotiable. Now, these are per web server, so there are things that Microsoft could do on the back end to increase the number of web servers for you, and they are per user. So there are ways to kind of work around this, but in general, they are essentially non-negotiable, and they're kind of a separate discussion from what we're talking about here today. So let's not mix them in if we can avoid that. So there's a document, and I've got the link here at the bottom of the page, that basically was pretty scary. It came out a little bit before October 2019, and it basically said, hey, if you exceed the Power Platform requests that you're entitled to, we're going to slow you down. And this is going to relate to Power Apps, Power Automate, and the Common Data Service. And we're going to count everything that you do. So kind of imagine for the moment that you went to the rental car counter at the airport, and instead of paying a flat fee for, like, X number of dollars for using it for an entire 24-hour period, and every 24-hour period you get charged another flat fee, they said, well, Jerry, what we're going to do is we're going to allow you to perform so many automobile actions. And once you exceed those automobile actions, we're going to slow your speed of your vehicle down. Okay, that's what this kind of implied. So it says, hey, every time you roll down your windows, every time you touch the brake, every time you move your seat back and forth, every time you touch a dial on the entertainment panel and you tap on the screen to change the channel on Spotify or XM radio or any of the broadcast channels you're listening to, or anytime you open or close the door or run the windshield wipers, those are all going to count as actions. And once you accumulate your allowed actions that you're entitled to for the day, then your car is no longer going to go over a certain speed. That's what this sort of says. That's not what's happening at all. Totally ignore everything on this page and on this document as it relates to Power Apps and Common Data Service. They are not paying attention to that. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Totally ignore this scary warning here. The only thing that's being managed is Power Automate. And they are looking at the API requests that your Power Automate flows consume. Okay, now within the context of the word entitlement, I can use the word consume, but I'm not using consume outside of the phrase entitlement. So as your flows are processed and as they go through and they traverse each of the action cards, they consume a API call. Okay, let's hold that thought for a minute. That is different than the way Power Automate Flow initially was released and licensed. It was initially released and licensed on a per run basis. So as a user, you got so many runs of Power Automate Flow during a 24-hour period, and those allocations rolled up at the tenant level so everybody could draw from the same pool. Now it's at a per user level, and now it's based upon what's going on inside of the flow, not on the flow runs. So these request limits have been established based upon various license types, okay? And within these license types, we'll just kind of focus on the highest level license, which is the most expensive, the enterprise license. It allows 20,000 entitlement of 20,000 or 20,000 API calls per day in the entitlement. Now this is a per user, and it's kind of a use it or lose it scenario, and it doesn't roll up or accumulate at the tenant level, okay? So if you have 10 users, you don't get 200,000 API requests to use as a general pool for everybody in the tenant. Each user gets charged for the API calls that the flows consume that they own, okay? So we'll move down here one more time. The next slide here. So then they produce something to kind of intended to explain things a little bit better, which were performance profiles. And I've got the docs page on that also here at the bottom of that screen. And they put the licenses into different buckets, 5 different buckets, in terms of what they were doing here during this transition period. Okay, and during the transition period, they have a much more relaxed approach to how they're looking at your entitlement usage and what they're doing if you go over that usage. So the medium low 2 plan included this enterprise plan that we're looking at, and it also included non-interactive users, which would be a service principal account or a traditional non-interactive user account. These are non-licensed users. You cannot log into the user interface using these credentials. It's only for programmatic access. And then they also put the per automate or the Power Automate per flow plan in the high category. So let's kind of remember these two, medium, low 2, and high. So now if we look at the next slide from their docs, they're saying executions per hour based upon your performance profile. They're saying 100,000 for medium, low 2, and 500,000 for high. So what does this mean? So they're saying here in the explanation is during the transition period, which has been going on for several months here in it went on for several months of 2020, and it continues to go on here in 2021, is they're saying, hey, these are less strict, and there's a kind of a grace allowance, and that instead of paying attention to what you're doing and taking some action at 20,000 API calls per day, they're saying, hey, we're not going to really start listening to and potentially doing something until you get 100,000 for medium, low 2, or 500,000 for the high. Now, they are giving us a warning that these limits are going to change after the transition period, okay? The reality to this is even this explanation document that they have here on the back end, they're not really following either, because even though it says 100,000 for medium, low 2, which is 5 times the allowed licensed entitlement of 20,000, they're actually not starting to pay attention to almost 10 times that amount, or 200,000 API calls per 24-hour period. So if we go over here to the next screen, we're going to see here that the license document has Power Automate per business process plan, 15,000 daily API requests per license flow. And I'm reading that because I want to reinforce what it's saying here. And it's saying, hey, this is for 5 units or 5 flows that you would specifically provide the URL for. So this is sort of interesting here. So that in the license plan, which is an additional per automate plan that you're going to buy here, the license document says 15,000, but guess what? They're saying here in the policy program, it's actually allowing up to 500,000. So that's a major differentiator. So in the case of the per plan, you're entitled to 15,000, but they've escalated that to 500,000. There's no 10x multiplier there. It's a lot more than 10x. But in the case of the enterprise plan, it's a 10x multiplier, but in reality, it's really a 20x multiplier. It's really 200,000 API. So this is something that takes a few moments to digest, okay? So let's see if I can kind of sum up a few things here that are important to note. I've previously blogged about some of these items. I've just mentioned a few of them here, but let's kind of recap what we need to know. And that is that the API calls are tracked against the owner/creator of the flow, and it's not related to the credentials being used for the connection to take the action on the Dataverse database. Okay, so this is really important, because if you as Joe Smith create the flow and then you're using some other user's credentials for whatever reason to read and write to the records in the action steps, that other user is not the one that's going to be charged for the API consumption for that action. It's going to be you, Joe, the owner, the creator. Okay. Number 2, even though everything I've spoke about up to now and everything on the docs pages says that the entitlement is at the user level, the reality of it is on the back end, on the servers, the flows are being throttled not at the user level, but at the flow level. So let me give you an example. Joe owns and has created 5 flows, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Flows 1, 2, and 3 are just kind of humming along, and they are consuming maybe a couple thousand API calls per day. They're doing great. They're well under the 20,000, not a problem. The total number is well over the 20,000. Flow number 4 is doing some heavy duty integration between two systems, and it's consuming 200,000 API calls per day. That's the flow that's going to be subject to be throttled, and it's not going to have any effect if that flow ends up getting throttled, i.e. slowed down, on the other flows that are running that Joe owns. So when you can work with Microsoft and you can open up a support ticket currently and get a reprieve in case your flows are consuming even more than the gracious 10x multiplier that it's allowed to. You open up a support case, they're going to ask you for the tenant ID, and they're going to ask you for the flow URL. Don't care about the user. They're going to ask you for the flow URL, and they're going to be able to unthrottle you for a period of time. Now, that flow user that owns that flow does need to be a licensed user. They will not do it for free or unlicensed flows. Okay. So one of the best practice recommendations is to use a service principal or non-interactive account for being the owner of the flows, because that non-interactive account gets 100,000 API calls per 24 hours in the tenant to use, versus a licensed user may be getting as many as 20,000 if you have the full enterprise license. Fewer lower licenses would have a lower entitlement. So the best practice recommendation is to take these flows that are running for the benefit of the entire organization, that are enterprise class flows, to be owned by the service principal account. The problem with that is there's no way to change a flow owner creator to the service principal account ownership. You can add the service principal account as a co-owner, but you can't affect the owner creator status. You cannot do that through the UI, even though it appears that you can do it, it doesn't work correctly, and you can't do it through the web API. We've tried doing it in Anthology through our ADO pipeline push, and set up a Azure function user as the owner. It does add it as the owner, and I will show you that on a screenshot here in a moment. But it doesn't change the owner creator, so it has no impact. That is a bug that they're working on fixing, and that is critical to being able to implement the adherence to the real implementation of this, rather than what's going on during the transition period. Number 4 is the scary statement that we saw that said, hey, starting October 2019, if you use more than your entitlements, you're going to be slowed down. That is absolutely irrevocably not happening. Do not worry that a marketing rep starts their day importing, 50,000 records from a list that they got from some third-party source, and that's going to consume all their API calls for a 24-hour period. And as a consequence, they're going, next time they log into your model-driven app, they're going to open it up and things are going to just crawl along. They're not going to be able to do anything. It's going to slow them down. They're not going to be able to add, update, or create records. That's not going to happen. Totally ignore that. The team has no interest in making that happen. That sort of goes back to kind of like the days when they changed the storage model. And if you exceeded your storage, this kind of goes back, maybe 7-8 years now. And if you exceeded your allotted storage, that you could only read records, you could not create any new records. Well, after the uproar about that, they changed their policy on that. So user experience, item number 4, not impacted. Lastly, there is no way that you can call up to support and get out of the service protection limits. Everybody has to abide by the service protection limits. Even Microsoft's first-party applications do. For example, the customer voice team is going to be releasing a change to their data model because they've had situations where they have exceeded the service protection limit, and they've gotten you get a 429 error when you've overrun the protection limit. So consider this example like for customer voice, and you can apply this to your own world also. Let's say a marketing person sends out a customer voice survey invite to 20,000 students at a university, in our case, and those students jump on that survey and start filling in the questions with the answers. There's 10 questions in the survey, and a whole bunch of them hit submit at the same time. Well, that goes off to Azure. It's processed in Azure, but the Azure engine is going to connect with your Dataverse environment and start creating question-answer record pairs. Well, that could happen at such a rate, given the success of the survey, that the customer voice connection would overwhelm the service protection limits. They don't want that to happen. They're changing their data model slightly to accommodate that. So what are some of the things that we should be doing today as a consequence, either to fix things now, but also to kind of put us in a good position for the future? So definitely we want to use the service principal account, use a non-interactive account. You can have multiple service principal accounts in your tenant, but the reality of it is the Microsoft system is smart enough to know that it's not going to give 100,000 to service principal account 1 and 100,000 to service principal account 2. It's going to keep track of the number of non-interactive accounts that you have, and it's still all going to be drawing from the same pool of 100,000 API calls. Unfortunately, there is not a citizen dev method to do that today. Anything that's friendly from a UI standpoint, but if you can do it from a programmatic standpoint, it will set you up for the future. The next thing that you need to do is make sure that there are multiple owners for the flows in your system that could be subject to throttling, because what happens is once your flow exceeds the allowed limit during the transition, net time is very high. Later on, it will be potentially less. Is after 7 days, you're going to get maybe 3 days and 7 days. It's confusing. I think quite now it's unclear as to whether it's 3 or 7 days or both. But at 3 and 7 days, let's assume, an email is going to go out to the owners of the flow that says, hey, your flow has used more than its allowed entitlement plus its exception for X number of consecutive days in a row, and it's subject to being turned off after 14 days. And after 14 days of consecutively over exceeding your allotment or your entitlement, they're going to turn your flow off. And if all you've got is a non-interactive account that owns the flow, or an account that owns the flow, that made the flow, but it's not a true user account in the sense that it's not an account that someone is actively using and has a mailbox associated with it to check, those emails are going to go off into oblivion. So make sure that you share your flows with other real users in your system. Now, Charles recommended to me that he doesn't want us seeing us change our architecture to fit the license model, and he wants to hear from us if that happens. So I've talked to him about it a little bit. We're going to actually do some things ourselves to make some adjustments in our flows because, quite frankly, they weren't very efficient or as efficient as they needed to be. And we are going to move some things to a plugin and to Azure Functions. But in general, you should not be doing major changes to your solutioning approach just to fit your technology into the license model. I did look at using the use invoke user function in the trigger. That really doesn't help. One reason is it doesn't work with child flows. And number two, it really doesn't change it because it's still the owner creator of the flow that gets charged for the entitlements. Doesn't matter whose context it's running under. Probably the biggest thing that we can all do is be better at how we're using flow and designing our flows and to watch our loops. So be laser focused on what's going on inside of your loops. And is there anything that you can move outside of that loop so it's not incurring a API call every time it runs through that action card? And I've got a blog post about this, and I've got some links here later on in the PowerPoint slide deck that you can check out. We need to be diligent right now in looking at the analytics screen for each of the flows. This is something else that's somewhat deficient, and they're behind on giving us some good analytics views. I know that they're looking into it. what they're offering today to us is not really sufficient for deriving insightful information, either when you're making a flow to understand what its impact is on your entitlements, or if you're an administrator looking at the bigger picture for your organization. So as in number 6, I kind of recap what I said also about the warning at 7 days, turned off at 14 days. And I'm going to let you in on a big secret, but actually it's not a secret because it's on their docs page, is that if the flow is updated at any time during the 14-day period, it resets the counter. And I'm going to show you a flow that I put together that you could use as a starting point to do this within your organization. So if on day number 2, the flow is modified, the counter starts again. Nice little workaround. It is kind of a hack, but it's something that you could use. Here, and just to kind of clarify it, if you go to this page in the docs site, it is actually spelled out. And in fact, it's been mentioned to me more than once on various product calls. This is not under NDA, it's not any secret. It's right on the docs page. It explains that anytime during the 14-day period, once again, if you modify the flow, and the modification can be simple. I'm going to show you where I'm going to fake a name change to it, and it updates the modified date. So if you go out to the CRMinnovation.com site where I do my blogging, you can see a number of blog posts that I've made that are relevant to this subject. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is take a look at this document or white paper that came out about almost 2 years ago on building enterprise-ready flows. I do have a proprietary interest in this because I did author this document for Microsoft. And even though there's been a lot of improvements within the Power Automate Flow program with features and functions since then, it's still 100% relevant. And it describes a 6-step process that can walk you through building flows that run the way they're supposed to, run as expected, and run reliably. So this is kind of a slide here on the deck before I go to the demo. Basically, it's showing the analytics page, and on this particular screen, I captured a flow that on January 4th, it exceeded the 200,000 API calls for that day. So that for that day, it would have been throttled or slowed down until the calls had dropped off, and it dropped below the 200,000, and then it would have sped up again and run at the regular rate. It was in no danger of being turned off because it was not over that red line limit for 14 days in a row. You can see how to the right of it, it was below most of the days, and one of the other days here, about 10 days later, it almost touched it, but it did not. Let's look at some live stuff. And I'm going to show you a couple different things, 3 different things, and we'll go to the demo. Let me just get my screen reconfigured here. Okay, so I'm in an environment and I've got 3 flows, and let me just update this, refresh this page here. It was set up to what I was doing about an hour ago, doing some practicing for the session. So about an hour ago, I modified these flows. So basically, and I'm in Engage Working Dev. So now if I go over to, there we go. I'm going to go over to the flow that I created, list and update all flows. It's set up with a button for demo purposes right now. But normally you would set this up with a recurrence. But before I go any further, what you'll notice over here is that I've got an owner here and the owner over here. So we're the same here because that's me. I've created as real user, and we're going to take a look at this here. So if I go to the edit mode, we'll just dissect this flow. And there'll be opportunity for questions if you just come off mute and they can ask some questions. So we're going to trigger the flow, and I've got a tool here where I've in the management utility where I want to list my flows in the Engage Working Dev environment. And then once I return that list of flows, I'm going to go through this apply to each. Now I have to have a get step in here, unfortunately. It's an extra action card that I had to put in here. And the reason I needed that is because there's a dynamic value that I needed in my update action that I didn't get from the list my flow step, unfortunately. So in particular, what that was the flow definition. So the flow definition was not returned from the list my flows. It was only available from the get a flow action card. So I kind of doubled the number of actions that or API calls that I have to do within this loop. Not a best practice, but I had no way to avoid it. So I've got my environment engaged working dev. I'm in prototype 03 because I don't want to run this flow inside of the same environment that I'm making these changes. And I've got the custom value and basic. I'm going to look at that here and I'll show you what that is. That's the flow name. And I'm grabbing that from, if you look here at the value, from the get a flow to get the flow definition step here, right here. So I'm getting the flow name from here, from this step right here, as it's looping through in the list, in the apply to each. I'm grabbing the display name, and I'm putting the same display name that came from this when I read the record into the write step or update step, and the same thing with the flow definition. And the flow state here is also something that I'm grabbing from the get a flow step, because I don't want to change the state. If it was on or off, if we look over here, we see that this flow number 2 is on, flow 1 and 3 are off. I don't want to change that. So now I'm going to run my flow, and I'll just run it in test mode right here. Test mode is just wonderful. It's just great for working with your flows. It's so much easier to do this than working in the classic workflow environment. So it's going to run, and this is a action that is not particularly fast. I mean, it has to connect. It lists the flow, but the process of updating the flow is a relatively slow process. I only have 3 flows that it needs to look at and do something with. And you think it would happen like really darn quick. It took 2 seconds to do the read, but the updating takes a lot longer. So this is something that you're going to have to factor into your process if you use this, that updating flows are more time consuming. So it took 28 seconds to do that. So now if I come over here to the environment that has the 3 flows, these show 56 minutes ago. And if I do a refresh, we're going to refresh the page, and it should say like a couple seconds ago now when it shows up. And then we'll drill down and we'll actually open up one of the flows. 34 seconds ago. So let's look at here, this one that was off. And what you're going to see is February 19th, 10:30 a.m. And that is my local time here in Kansas in the United States. So that's all it takes. And what did I do? Basically, I read the name of this flow, flow number 1. This is just an example flow. It doesn't do anything. I didn't change any of the action cards. I didn't have to add an action card. I didn't have to subtract an action card. I didn't have to do anything. All I did was come in here and say, get the name of this flow and then update it with the same name. And that changed the modified on date. Pretty convenient. This will work to reset the counter for this flow. So if we had any analytics, which this flow really has not been run because it's a dummy flow, if we were to come over here in analytics, which is probably going to tell us nothing here in this little Power BI report that spins up, it would basically essentially, all practical purposes, reset the counter. Is this something that you really should do? You may want to consider this if you have high volume flows that are in danger of being throttled, that you do not have a owner that has a mailbox that would be checked to be notified that the flow is in danger of being throttled. And in most cases, you really can't do much. I mean, if you've got a efficiently running flow that is using a lot of API calls, then it potentially is not fixable. It's based upon whatever the source data is doing and so forth. Let me grab another screen over here. Now what you see here is a flow that was updated through our ADO pipeline most recently, and we made the owner the Azure Function user, which is a service of principal account. And this was an attempt to use the web API to change the owner, but guess what? It didn't change the owner over here. And this is the owner/creator. And this is the owner account that is, so to speak, charged for the API calls for this flow, not this owner or any other owners over here. So until the web API or the back end is fixed, we're not able to effect a change over here, which is another reason we're in this grace transition period while Microsoft is getting everything together and figuring out exactly where they're going to land with the licensing plan and give us the technology capabilities to make these changes. Now, if I were to look at the analytics for this particular flow by clicking on this button right here, what happen is I'd be taken to this page and I can see here everything for the last 30 days. You can go 30, 14, or 7 days. And you can see these are action requests, which is the same thing as API calls. And it looks like we hit 30,000 on a couple of days and we're just over it on 1 day. So we would have been over the 20,000 limit based upon the entitlement for this user, Campus Management Oberlin, which has the enterprise class license. But the reality of it is we never approached the 200,000 level that I showed you on the PowerPoint slide with this flow. So this flow is not at risk of getting throttled at all during the transition period. After the transition period, could it be throttled because it's over 20,000? Yes, maybe, probably, but that kind of depends on terms of what rules they produce later on here in 2021 once we leave the transition period. So this is the place that you need to go. Unfortunately, quite frankly, it's not a safe place to go, in my opinion, because I am in the live environment. I have to click on the analytics button, which happens to be right next to the turn off button, which I don't want to just kind of move around and click over there accidentally. So I have to go into make.powerapps.com. I have to go to my solutions. I have to find all my flows that I want to look at, which could be spread across several different solutions. And I have to search through and find the right solution and then drill down to the right flow. Not very convenient right now. They are going to make it more convenient. I'm confident that that will happen. So in this particular case, I had to go into import. And I found my import flows that have an integration between a third-party source and the Dataverse environment. And then I had to go in and then click here to see my flow. All the while I'm in a production environment, not a good place to be. It's risky, mistakes happen. And I have to click on this analytics and I get to see my analytics. So come back over here to my slide deck. So at this point in time, I'd like to open it up for questions. Might have to come off mute. And while I'm waiting for any questions to pop up, be sure to fill out the survey, give me some feedback. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, just put in the connection message, just say that you attended the bootcamp presentation, and I will be able to accept immediately your connection request. Any questions from anybody?
So it's not possible to receive the question because it's not available for this live event. So I think it's a very interesting session, very interesting. And I don't know if you want to share again something, your opinion, or I don't know, it's okay. Otherwise, we can close here the live event.
Oh, Fabio, so they can't come off of mute and ask any questions by voice?
No, it's not possible by this channel. No.
Okay. So definitely then, in that particular case, here's how to get in touch with me. You can find me on LinkedIn, connect with me and message me there. Send me an email to jweinstock@anthology.com or send me a Twitter message to @CRM Innovation. So I guess to wrap it up is we're in a transition period. Microsoft is trying to figure out something that will work for them and work for us. The reality of it is Power Automate has caught on like crazy. There are more than 25 billion, and when I say billion, that's with a B, billion API requests per 24-hour period. This is a huge activity level. I mean, it's just crazy to me that I just can't imagine the number of servers that they have supporting this worldwide. And the reality of it is that there are some people that are perhaps using more than fair share. They're very noisy neighbors, and they have to have some guidelines to make sure that this doesn't go out of control or get further out of control than it is. So the entitlement approach was a step in that direction, but I believe the execution of that is evolving. And I think we're going to be in a good place, or in a place that's somewhat definable by the end of the current Microsoft fiscal year, which would be in June. Maybe before we'll see some specific announcements relative to adjustments in the entitlement licensing. I suspect at the end of the day, you're going to get a starter amount of API calls, and then there's going to be some method for having you get charged for additional API calls as you use them. Okay. Right now, there's a hard-coded add-on that you can buy for that allows 10,000 more API calls, and you can go out to portal.office.com and purchase it. But once again, there's another gap here between what appears that you can do and what you can actually do, and that gap is once you've bought the license, you can't actually apply it to your tenant to consume the add-on features, which is the additional API calls. So there's a number of things that have not come out just right. They are diligently working on that. I can tell you they are. I've talked to Charles Lamanna about it. He is committed to getting this sorted out and working, and and I think he wants to get it done in such a way that it is as painless as possible for 98% of the users out there. They haven't had a lot of fun answering all the questions. I've been relentless with the product team. There's not a week that goes by that I don't send a question in about entitlements in one aspect or another. So hold on, implement some of the steps that I've suggested here. Make your flows as efficiently as possible. Continue to use and support Power Automate Flow. It's the way to go. And just let me know if you'd like to have a further discussion. And most particularly, if you want to talk about water skiing or adventure motorcycle riding, definitely get in touch with me. Fabio, thank you very much for having the opportunity to present today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Great session.